2. Check, 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 check.
I thought you were going to zoom in. Well, I can't see if anybody falls asleep, so Tucker, you'll have to monitor that. If they do, you can look out the office window there and see. This is where you're supposed to be doing a confessional here now. At least you've got a good solid background behind you. It always tears me up on you're watching the news or something and they're interviewing somebody on Zoom and they put a background on there, but it doesn't, you know, they don't have a solid color behind them. So like half of their face keeps disappearing and stuff like that. Yes, it's working. I'm talking to Tucker right now. Who did? Oh. Mother said Glenn just texted in sick on the elders ministers line. Are they selling popcorn yet? Webb had said he was going to sell some popcorn. Lauren just texted and said the filters are cracking everybody up. Maddie said so. Yeah, I can't hear y'all or see y'all, but I'm assuming y'all can hear and see me at this point. So I was showing Tucker earlier, these are a couple of my favorite backgrounds that I will use on occasion whenever I need to. Of course, there's Floyd's Barbershop there. I have used, where is it at here? I've used this one several times. I'm not sure why let me mirror. There we go. And it makes it look like I'm at a press conference for the University of Tennessee. This is a favorite of mine to use, like I'm turkey hunting. And this one, like I'm out duck hunting. But when I use them, and I don't use them very often, I probably use this one more than any other. So Melody said Webb just texted that I was coming through loud and clear. So I will remove, I'll get serious now, and I'll remove my background. I have 6:31 Central Daylight Savings Time, 5:31 Mountain Daylight Savings Time. So I'm assuming, Tucker, all you need to do is just shake your head yes or no. Everything's coming in loud and clear. You can hear and see. Ron Ayers, I'm assuming, is in the audience somewhere. At the end of our Bible class this evening, Ron's going to do the announcements, and either he will lead a closing prayer or he will ask someone to lead y'all in a closing prayer. But we did obviously make it out to Colorado safe and sound, and got here in time today to go eat lunch with Garrett and his new fiance Bailey. And Garrett and Gannon and Melody and Gordon are all down here in BRC2. It's the classroom name that we're in, and we are glad to be here for the festivities of this weekend, but we miss all of y'all and look forward to being back with y'all next week. You're going to have two great lessons this week. Aaron and Patrick are going to preach this Sunday, and they'll do a great job undoubtedly with that, and it'll be good for y'all to have a break from me for the first time this year, I guess it's been. So yeah, Tucker's over there. Thank you. So prayers are answered sometimes, Tucker. So but anyway, I know a lot of y'all have sent texts that you've been praying for us as we've traveled, and we appreciate that. Melody made it fine. She took up the whole our middle row of seats and did fine with her knee, and so we're Mom and Daddy and Melody's parents, Mike and Rita Manus, are somewhere between here in St. Louis. We're not sure where on their way out here, and they should be here tomorrow. So keep them in your prayers as they travel, if you would. But we're proud of Garrett, like any parent would be. But we're glad that we get to be out here and be a part of such a special weekend. We are in John chapter 11 tonight, and we're going to begin in verse 45, where we left off last week, with one of the great moments in the Gospels, period, much less in the Gospel of John. We've gone through so many of these signs, and of course, John 20, 30 through 31 is really the key to understand the book. We've talked about repeatedly. Many other signs truly did Jesus, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ or the Messiah, and that believing you might have eternal life in his name. We've seen so many signs, but now we're getting to the biggest of the signs, and the raising of Lazarus is one. We talked about last week what a scene that would have been to have been there outside of that cave whenever Jesus said, "Lazarus, come forth," and that moment where I'm sure you could have heard a pin drop when this man who had been dead for long enough that everybody's saying he's been in the grave 4 days, he's going to be stinking by now, walks out, and Jesus says, "Unwrap him." And what a beautiful scene. We mentioned last week that the punchline of that sign is Jesus saying that he is the resurrection and the life. And not only is he the resurrection and that he helps us overcome the problem of death, but he's the life. In John, life is that relationship that we have with God the Father and God the Son from John chapter 17 and verse 3. And what a beautiful picture that is of Lazarus, that dead man coming out of the grave to live again. And Jesus says, unwrap the things that have bound him. That's the same thing that happens to us when we come out of that watery grave of baptism, being raised to walk in newness of life. And Jesus takes away all of the things that are binding us, our sins, and the things that hurt us. And just a lot of symbolism going on in this sign in particular. And as we've talked about, this is something that by the time John is writing this, near the end of the first century, this was I'm sure an occurrence that a lot of people had heard about and were very familiar with, but yet it was one that as John writes about it for us, it's so impactful when we think about it on all the different levels that we can. So verse 45, we're kind of going to focus on tonight as we hopefully get down through the first few verses of chapter 12, some reactions to Jesus. Now that Jesus has performed this really big sign, what's the reactions to Jesus that we're going to have? Well, in verse 45, we see the first of those. It says that many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. So there's lots of these people that, because they've seen this sign that Jesus has performed, they're going to believe in him. Again, John 20, 30 through 31. That's the point of the signs, and in this one in particular. And the raising of Lazarus from the dead is such a significant one. You wonder why John is the only one that has recorded this particular sign, but nonetheless, he is the only one. This is one of 6 different miracles that Jesus performs that we only have in John. You've got Jesus turning the water to wine in John chapter 2. You've got the official son who was healed in John chapter 4. You've got the paralytic who was healed in John chapter 5. You've got the blind man who was healed in John chapter 9. Lazarus here being raised from the dead in John 11. And then when we get over to chapter 21, there's going to be a great catch of fish that was miraculous that is only recorded in John's gospel. There's been other great catches of fish that the other gospel accounts will talk about, but the one in chapter 21 after the resurrection, John's the only one that tells us about that. So it's great that we've got this scene, and as awesome a scene as this has been, we're going to get to maybe an even cooler scene here in just a minute that we'll talk about in just a little bit. In verse 46, it says, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the first sign that we have, the first reaction that we have to this sign is that some believe, which is what the purpose of the signs was really all about, was to cause people to believe. But not everyone is going to believe. And when you read verse 46, it may be that we want to read something sinister or bad into what goes on in verse 46. It's not necessarily anything sinister or bad. The Pharisees were their Bible teachers. They were the spiritual leaders of the people. So it's only natural that when something like this has happened, that they would want to go and tell them. So it's interesting again that we think about, like in John chapter 7 and 8, and the different ways that the opinions that people had about Jesus, some were good and some were negative. And it's just interesting that, again, you're seeing a different way of reacting to Jesus. Some are going to believe in Jesus. And then some of these people are, well, let's go tell the Pharisees about it and see what they have to say about it. So in verse 47, it says, so the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. And so the chief priests and the Pharisees, they gather together the council, which would be the Sanhedrin court. Notice that they said that this man is performing many signs, and he has. Now, again, we've talked about how that in John, signs are not necessarily miracles. All the miracles are signs, but not all of the signs are miracles, but they have this deeper spiritual meaning to all of them. So what are we going to do? This guy's performing all of these signs. What are we going to do? Well, as a reader, you might think, well, what you could do is you could believe and follow him. That would be a pretty good reaction to him. But their reaction is not what you might expect it to be. It's not, let's see if this is the Messiah. They're concerned because they fear that they might lose their power. They're saying the signs are troubling because it may take away our authority. These are the people that supposedly know the scriptures better than anyone. And it never for a moment crossed their mind that maybe this is who the prophets have been talking about. And it's a lesson for us today because, just because you know the scripture better than anyone else doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to listen to what it says. Just because you know a lot about God doesn't mean you can't be blind to God. After all, Satan and the demons know a lot about God, right? Our knowledge is only as good as your willingness to apply it to your life, see? And so they know a lot about him, but they're still not willing to apply it and see how that it should affect them in a positive way. So if we let him go on like this, many are going to believe in him, and there are many that are believing. But they think if we let Jesus live, there's going to be a rebellion. That's the problem. That's what they mean by the Romans will come and take away our place in our nation. This is Passover time, and every year at Passover, we think of Passover as like a religious spiritual feast, and on some levels it was, of course, because it's about honoring God for what he did in the Exodus story. But probably the thing that maybe it would most evenly correlate to with our way of thinking would be like Independence Day, 4th of July. On the 4th of July, we celebrate our Independence Day, and we think about the men and women that have laid down their lives so that we could have the freedoms that we enjoy. We think about how that our freedom was won from the tyrannical kingship of England and those types of things, and that's more along the lines of what they're thinking. They're thinking about freedom. They're thinking about independence. They're thinking about deliverance. Okay. And so every year at Passover, the Jews would start talking about rebellion. When you drop down to verse 55, you're going to see that again. But they're afraid the Romans aren't going to put up with it, and they would send forces down. Now, it's interesting that these religious leaders are more content being ruled by a foreign country rather than investigating God's plan. And sometimes we're that way. Sometimes we're more interested in being content than being holy. We can be more interested in what is comfortable rather than what is biblical. We can be more interested in what's convenient rather than what's biblical. See, but following Jesus would be costly for them. And so they say, well, let's do something about this guy. There's no sense in just standing around like we can't stop him. We are the ones in charge. We are the ones that are the council. So in verse 49, it says, but one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to him, you know nothing at all. Now, Joseph Caiaphas is this guy's name. He was the son-in-law of Annas, who was the high priest. Annas was the high priest from 6 AD to 14 AD. And after that, there were several of his family that was appointed to be high priest. That's not the way the high priest was supposed to have been chosen, but that's the way it wound up being chosen. If you could keep the Romans happy, then you would get to be appointed. So Caiaphas was helping, in a way, Annas to keep his power. The Jews would have recognized Annas as being the high priest, but the Romans recognized Caiaphas, and officially he was. And so there had been so many of them that had gone through, and there shouldn't have been that many high priests in that short of time, but there have been so many high priests that had gone through. John makes this comment about him being the high priest that year, because you really had to pay attention to your high priest history to know who was the high priest at that time. But Caiaphas was high priest from like 18 AD to 36 AD. What's interesting, I don't know what to make of it necessarily, but what's interesting is that he lost his high priesthood in 36 AD, which was the same year that Pilate lost his position. So it's interesting, at least, that they both lost power at the same time when both of them are so closely related to what's going to happen to Jesus, of course. In verse 50, nor do you understand that it's better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. And so from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. So what Caiaphas means is we got to kill this one guy, or the Romans are going to come down and lots of people are going to die. Now, Caiaphas' take on this is different from what John's take on this is. Caiaphas was not trying to be prophetic, but he is. He's thinking political. But that really is what Jesus is going to do. Jesus is going to die so that we all don't have to die for our sins. And John's going to clarify that when we get in verses 51 and 52 that we read. He's going to clarify really that's what it means. So without knowing it, John says, what he's doing is he's telling this great spiritual truth. And by the way, if you remember back in chapter 10, when we were talking about Jesus being the good shepherd, and in verse 16, he said, I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock with one shepherd. When we were studying that, I told you that there's nothing in that context of chapter 10 that would make you think Gentiles, but he's got to be talking about the Gentiles. Well, verses 51 and 52 of chapter 11 is what makes you think in chapter 10 and verse 16 that he's talking about the Gentiles. See, this gospel was a gospel written to the Gentiles. And again, we're probably about 60 years past the establishment of the church, and you've got lots of these Gentiles. If John is in Ephesus when he writes this, which is where history says that he went after his exile on Patmos, then he's writing it specifically for a bunch of Gentile Christians. So that's who he's talking about. So verse 53, they planned from that day forward, they made plans to put him to death. Because it was better for Jesus to die than for all the Jews to die, it's a done deal. We're going to try to find how we can put him to death. We looked at all the options, tried to find another way, but now that you've raised someone from the dead, we got to do something. We got to act. This is one that we can't cover up. Remember when he healed the man born from, he was blind from his birth? They tried to say that he wasn't really blind, or they tried to say he was faking it, or some of those kind of things. Well, we can't cover this up and argue with it. We talked about last week, Lazarus apparently was his family pretty well known. Everybody knew he was dead. Everybody knew he'd been in that cave for 4 days. Everybody knew he was at the point of stinking. He'd been in there so long. You can't argue with that one. We can't say that Lazarus was faking death for 4 days in the cave. Okay? We've got a walking, talking problem, and his name is Lazarus. And so it's better that Jesus die than for all of us to perish, right? Well, yes, that's what John 3:16 says, that it was better for Jesus to die than for all to perish. God wasn't willing for everyone to perish. He wanted all of us to be saved, and that's why Jesus would die for us. But again, John's take on it is way different than what Caiaphas is in this particular case. So verse 54, Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness to a town called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. Now, Ephraim is not too far from Jerusalem, but the precise location of it, we're not sure where that is. Maybe one day archaeologists will find that. There's been a number of places in the Bible that we read about that archaeologists and historians say there's no such a place. We never found them. And then they go to dig a foundation for a new hotel or something like that. And, oh, here's a whole little village we found. And it turns out to be one of these villages that they said didn't exist. So maybe archaeologists will find Ephraim one day, but right now we don't know exactly where it is. So Jesus, because they're looking to kill him now, Jesus gets out of town. But nobody is going to force his hand until he allows it, okay? Nobody's going to force Jesus to be put to death before Jesus is going to allow it. That's one of the things you remember Pilate talks about to him. Don't you know that I've got authority to put you to death? I've got authority to free you. And he says, you don't have any authority unless my Father gives it to you. So you're not going to force Jesus' hand. Well, think about what that means for us. If we're under Jesus' authority, that doesn't mean that we don't have trouble. Jesus himself had trouble. But what it means is that nothing happens to us without him allowing it. So that ought to make us want to walk in confidence. And it ought to make us think when things do happen, maybe look at it from the perspective of how can we glorify God in this trouble that we're going through, right? How can I point others to Jesus and what it is that I'm going through? Remember that anxiety or worry is a sin. But guess what else is a sin? Self-reliance is also a sin. See? So both ends of that spectrum, we need to get off of and just focus on Jesus and allow him to be Lord. Verse 55, now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. So think about all the way back at the very beginning of John, whenever John the Baptist sees Jesus and he says, behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. And then you start like in chapter 2, about verse 13-ish, somewhere around there, it talks about how that the Passover was at hand. The Passover is near. And all through John, and I've been trying to point this out, you've got all of this continual pointing to Passover. That, you know, there's obviously Passovers that Jesus lived through, and during his ministry of about 3 to 3.5 years, there was maybe 3 or 4 Passovers that he would have participated in. But in John, it's such a book of significance, the way things are laid out. You know, again, he's pointing us to this spiritual truth, the fact that Jesus is the Lamb of God, the Lamb for the Passover. Okay. Now, before they would go up to Passover, they would participate in a ceremonial cleansing. They would go to those mikvahs that Johnny and Ron and Danny and others of you maybe that have gone to Israel, those mikvahs that were everywhere. They would go to those places and do ceremonial cleansing before the Passover, just in case they had any kind of defilement in their lives that they needed to take care of. You might write Numbers chapter 9 and verse 6 next to this verse that tells about that. So if you're thinking it's Passover time and Jesus is going to come to Jerusalem for the Passover, because as a good Jewish male, he would be required to, what's he going to do before he comes up to Passover? He's going to go to one of those mikvahs and he's going to do the ceremonial cleaning. So if we're trying to find Jesus, what would be a good place to have a stakeout? Well, it'd be at one of those mikvahs, right? The problem is Jesus doesn't have to do that. He didn't have any defilement. So he doesn't have to do that. So they're in the wrong place for a stakeout, but they're trying to do everything they can at this point to get Jesus. So, you know, there's wanted posters up and all the normal. I don't know if they had post office back then and a bulletin board with the wanted posters, but if it did, that's what they. Jerry Seinfeld has a funny little bit he does about why do we put the wanted posters in the post office? Do we think that the most hardened criminals in America are going to come in to mail a postcard or something and we'll catch them there or something? I don't know, but he's on Crime Stoppers or whatever it might be. America's Most Wanted. It's talking about Jesus. That's who they're trying to get. They're looking for Jesus, and in their mind, it's just a matter of time. It's really all in God's time, but it's a matter of time before he shows himself and we're able to get him. So then in chapter 12, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So first of all, he's setting up what day it was, 6 days before Passover. And again, you've had all these times in the Gospel of John where the Passover's at hand, the Passover's near. Well, now we've got a definite timeline. We're 6 days before Passover, okay? And he's just setting up what day it is. You know, John is getting to this point where Jesus is going to be the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. And it was also at this time, again, when the Jews were thinking rebellion. And all of that's going to happen, come together in the case of what Jesus has done. Lots of false messiahs would arise during Passover time and say that they were the Messiah, and they would try to lead revolts, and the Romans would put them down and that type of thing. And that's kind of what they're thinking is probably the case with Jesus is going to be. But notice this description. Jesus comes to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. That's how he would have been known the rest of his life, is Jesus raised him from the dead. Lazarus was the guy that was dead, that was raised from the dead by Jesus. And so we're setting up that cool scene that I told you about, is what he's fixing to set up. Verse 2, they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. So think about the position here. Paint this picture in your head of how cool this would be. Now, they're giving a dinner, it says. We give suppers for everything. But here you raise me from the dead. I guarantee you we're going to have a supper in your honor, and that's what's happened. But again, don't overlook this moment here. It's huge. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. And to the point that we can't go to the grave and open it up because he's going to be stinking. And now you're sitting around this supper table, and over here is Lazarus, who was dead 4 days, reclined at the table eating, and sitting over here is Jesus, who was the one that walked up to the cave and said, Lazarus came forth and the dead man came out. And they're just sitting next to him, and they're eating, and they're telling stories like we do at supper time. And what was that like? Have you ever been to a supper or to a dinner or something, and there's people that are there that you just want to listen to them talk? Whenever I was preaching at Eastwood in Paris, Tennessee, to the south of us, a little ways in McKenzie, Jim Roberts was preaching at that time, and Jim had been there in McKenzie for, like 30 years. And then you go north of us up to Murray, and you've got John Dale, who had been preaching at Murray for like 35 or 40 years. And the two of them were good buddies, so they would meet in Paris halfway and eat lunch once a month. And John Dale called me one day, and he's telling me about him and Jim going to eat lunch. Would you like to come eat lunch with us? And I said, well, sure. And so, we get to the restaurant, and they start talking, and I'm just sitting there. And finally, John looks at me and he says, Corey, you can talk too. And I'm like, nope. Y'all got 75 years of experience in one congregation each. I just want to listen to y'all, And it was great conversations that we would have. So encouraging, and they would pray with me and for me and my family, and it was just awesome. But I didn't want to talk. I just wanted to soak in everything. Well, can you imagine being at the table with Jesus and Lazarus and the conversation they would have had of like, by the way, Jesus, the whole throne room up there blew my mind. I never could have pictured. I've read Daniel, but I didn't realize it looked like that, or, I don't know what but it was been amazing to have sit there and listen to those two. And of course, we're told Martha's serving. If you know anything about their personalities, then you're not surprised that she's serving, But note the fact that they're there eating supper. I have to point that out all the time because it's biblical. I don't know how many of y'all call the evening meal dinner, but it's not biblical. Okay, it's biblical to call it supper. So that's what we grew up calling it all the time. That's supper. Dinner you eat at about noon. But anyway, in reality, the Greek word here doesn't really indicate the time of day. It could have been any time of day, but since they're reclined at table, most people think that it's probably at evening. So you're there that evening with Jesus and Lazarus and just soaking in that conversation. And then Mary is going to enter the forefront of the scene in verse 3. Mary took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Now, a pound, this would be a Roman pound, which would be about 12 ounces as the way we would weigh it out. Nard is a plant that's grown in India. Very expensive perfume ointment that would have been used. Myrrh is also used here for that kind of thing. Very rare imported ointment. We're told that it's worth about 300 denarii, which would have been about a year's pay. So not a lot of expensive luxuries in households in that day. It was probably in a glass jar that was crimped at the end, and breaking it open meant that it would lose its value. It's the kind of stuff that you would put on a dead body. Remember, we talked about all that sappy stuff that they would put on them last week? Well, they would also, if you were very rich, you'd put this kind of stuff in there with it too to make it smell good, but used by rich folks, but only in small amounts. So again, think about this picture. They reclined at table. They would have kind of been leaning up toward the table, and their feet would have been extended back away from the table, and like their upper body, like leaning on an elbow at a low table, 12 inches, 14 inches off the ground. And she comes up behind them, and she begins to anoint Jesus's feet and wipe his feet with her hair. Just think about the countenance that shows, how she's going to serve this king. Kings were anointed on the head. This is about Mary as much as it is Jesus. Her anointing Jesus on his feet and wiping it with her hair is showing her willingness to submit to him, to allow him to be Lord. That I'm going to take this place of humility and put you on a pedestal. See, plus it's a really expensive gift, a big sacrifice. So there's all kinds of symbolism going on here. It talks about how that the smell, filled the room here. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. So the smell extended out, and it filled the whole house like our life should. Our devotion to Jesus should fill the room wherever we go. If you went and talked to some people that knew me, and you asked them, do you think that Corey really loves Jesus? Well, they say, oh man, every time you talk to him, his love for Jesus just fills the room. Or would they say, yeah, I guess he does. I don't know. Let's get real personal. Would my love for Jesus fill the rooms of my own house? A lot of times our love and devotion of Jesus, we'll let that fill other rooms when we go out in public. But what about if you went and talked to my wife and my children, and you said, you think Corey really loves Jesus? You think your daddy really loves Jesus? What would they say? Because they know. And a lot of us, we're really good at filling the rooms everywhere we go when we can kind of fool people. And we're going to talk a little bit about more of that when we get to another character here in just a minute. But at home, do the people that know me best, does my love for Jesus and my devotion for Jesus fill the own rooms of my house? See, this is an extravagant display of honor. It's an extravagant display of service. It's an extravagant display of the fact that she wants to serve him. Now, it's also important to point out, I think, this is not the woman of ill repute. In Luke chapter 7, you'll read of a story that's similar in a lot of the characteristics of the story and what it says about it. The hair wiping was the same thing. Only other time in the Bible we see something like that. It's a show of humility, and some get confused because of some of those things being similar, but it's not the same occurrence. There's no time that we're ever told that that Mary or Martha were women of ill repute and that type of thing. So this is a different total situation altogether. But she's doing this to show her humility and her devotion to the Lord. And then verse 4, Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, he who was about to betray him, said. So, John's writing this long after the fact. It's easy for John to now look back and say, Judas, he's the one that betrayed Jesus. John doesn't like Judas, and he makes it clear he doesn't like him. And every time John writes about Judas, he tells you some other fact about Judas that reminds you of how much he don't like Judas. But at the same time, that's easy to say now in hindsight, John, but in that day, again, this is 60 years later. During that time, Judas had y'all all fooled. See? When Jesus later on is going to, in that upper room, say, one of y'all is going to betray me, not a one of them says, I bet it's Judas. They all say, is it me? John thought it was more likely for him to betray Jesus than Judas. But Judas's eyes has got dollar signs in it at this point. He says, why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? Again, that 300 denarii is about a year's worth of wages. We could do a lot of good benevolent work with that, right? Now, again, it could mean that Lazarus, Mary, and Martha are wealthy. This could be a family heirloom, but for whatever, this is a lot of money that we're talking about here. And it's not that that's not a good thing. I mean, you look at what Judas says at face value, that would be a really good thing. We could use this money to go do good for other people. That would be awesome. And we live in a time, just to be very frank about it, we live in a time where a lot of people, that's their idea of what being a Christian, of being the church is all about, is just go out and do good for people. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do good for people, but that's not what the real point is all about, okay? So John adds this comment, verse 6. He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. You think John likes or dislikes Judas? He just calling it like it is, right? He said this because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what he put into it. So John's comment on this saying of Judas is that again, John didn't know it at the time, but he knows it now that he's writing this. And he's saying he didn't really care about the poor. He really was just looking out for how he could make some money, because he tells us he was the treasurer. He had the money bag, and he would help himself to whatever he wanted out of that money bag. If we've got we got a year's worth of wages in the money bag, it'd be really easy for me to slip a little bit out with that much money in there, and maybe nobody noticed, right? So again, lots of application here. We need to make sure that we don't turn into, as the church, that we don't turn into social workers, okay? That we don't replace honoring and worshiping Jesus with social activism. Our job is not to make people comfortable on their way to hell. Are we supposed to help people? Yes. But how do we ultimately help them? We point them to Jesus. Can we do that by doing benevolent work and kind things for them? Absolutely. Are people going to listen to Jesus if their stomach's growling? Probably not. But ultimately, how we help them is by pointing them to Jesus. Make sure that we don't leave out the Jesus part, or all the social help that we give people, the benevolent help we give people, is meaningless. Is your message help the poor like Judas, or honor Jesus like Mary? Because Jesus is fixing to make it clear, very clear, which one is the right message, okay? Now, again, Judas isn't really concerned about the poor. John tells us that, but he sounds good. Judas was so good at being a fake that they put him in charge of the money. His answer sounds good. And he probably even thinks, well, Jesus will agree with that one. He was not going to agree with that. See, she honored him with something expensive. How do we honor him? Do we give him our best, or do we keep back our best? Do we try to use our religion, our walk with Jesus, to profit ourselves like Judas? What are our priorities? Is it ourself? Is it others? Or is it Jesus? See, in verse 7, Jesus said, leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. So Jesus knows Judas. Remember the end of chapter 2 when it says that nobody had to bear witness to Jesus about any man because he knew every man and knew their heart. John doesn't find out about Judas till after the fact. But in the moment, Jesus knows Judas. Okay? So Maybe she didn't use all of it yet. I don't know. But Jesus just says, let her alone. What she's doing is the right thing. He says, you've always got the poor with you. Now, keep that in the context of John. In these previous verses, Jesus said, I'm going away, and they've all questioned all of that about him. In John chapter 7, well, where are you going? Why can't we go there? John chapter 8, where's he going? Is he going to the Gentiles? That kind of thing. He keeps talking about how that he's going away and that the Passover is near. They intend to keep him around for a while, like we all do with our loved ones. But he's not going to be. Judas is a thief, and Jesus knew that. God didn't make him be a thief, but he's going to use that, okay? So Jesus says, you're always going to have poor people. You can throw all the money at them you want to, and you're still not going to solve the poor problem. You're still not going to solve the hungry problem. There's always going to be people that need benevolent help. That's not the real issue here. The real issue is, are you honoring Jesus? And Judas wasn't willing to do that with anything that he was doing at this point. So in verse 9, when the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came not only to account of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. Now, you put yourself in that position. If you lived near, around Jerusalem, Bethany, that area, and Tucker had been telling you, hey, guys, I know of this guy that was dead for 4 days, and Jesus, maybe you've heard about some of the things he's been doing. That Jesus fellow showed up, walked out to the cave, had him roll the stone away, and said, come forth Lazarus, and he walked out of the grave, and he's alive to this day. And somebody was saying, you making that up. And then Tucker calls you the next day and says, hey, Jesus and Lazarus are down there at their house eating supper. Well, let's just go see who's wrong or right about that. Wouldn't you want to go see it? Absolutely, you'd want to go see it. So this big crowd hears Jesus is there, and they came to see Jesus, but they also came to see Lazarus, the guy that had been dead for 4 days, whose funeral they had gone to. See? They now know that this Jesus is really something special. It's at this point that this happens. All of these signs have been done now. All of the things done in the first 11 chapters are to show who Jesus was. And then in chapter 12, showing how all these signs, especially Lazarus, gets everybody fired up. Everybody is coming out of the woodwork, coming out of the hills to find Jesus and to follow Jesus and to know more about Jesus, especially because it's Passover time. It's Independence Day, and we've got the Messiah, and it's all leading up to this triumphant entry he's going to make into Jerusalem. They're ready for a revolution. They're ready for a new king, and Jesus is the one that can do it. How do you know? He raised a man from the grave that had been in the grave for 4 days. See? So in verse 10, it says, so the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well. Poor Lazarus, he just can't win, can he? I finally get to go be with the Lord, and then the Lord calls me back. And then now they're trying to kill me again. And that's what they're going to do. They've been now thinking that, that not only are they going to kill Jesus, but now we better kill Lazarus too, because he's the evidence. And if he's in the grave, then when Tucker says, I heard he killed Lazarus, we get down to Bethany and we find out Lazarus still in his tomb, then we're not going to believe him. So verse 11, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. So Lazarus is now the living proof. And as long as Lazarus is around, there's too much proof for Jesus, big proof. So think about the reactions to Jesus. Chapter 11:45 through chapter 12, verse 11. First reaction we saw was that people believed in Jesus. Many Jews. In fact, it's at the beginning of the text and it's at the end of the text that many Jews are believing in Jesus. That's really what he wants us to see, because it helps clarify not only what goes on in that text, but what we're going to see coming up in the near future. So reaction number one, many believe in Jesus. Now, have they really figured out exactly who he is and what he's going to do? No, but they're believing in Jesus. Second reaction, some want to go tell others. Some Jews did that. They wanted to go tell the Pharisees. They want to tell the religious leaders. They're wanting to figure out what's going on, find out some more information, whatever. Number 3 reaction is the Sanhedrin Council saying, what are we going to do this man? We'll reject him. That's what we'll do. We could follow him. We could believe him. We could listen to him. We could investigate the scriptures and figure out that he's who we've been waiting for. But no, we'll just reject him. Number 4 reaction is the reaction of Mary. We can worship him. We can honor him. We can serve him. We can sacrifice for Jesus. Or, number 5 reaction, we can be like Judas, and we can think of Jesus only a way that we can profit. So the question for tonight is, what is your reaction to Jesus? And this is not what we do and the people out in the world do. It's not us versus the people outside of our walls, or us and the non-church people, or whatever. All of these people that we're talking about in this section, chapter 11 down into chapter 12, are all for their time the religious people. They're God's people. And among God's people, some of us can believe in Jesus enough that we want to figure out more about him. Some of us believe in Jesus that we want to tell others about him so we can learn more about him. Some of us are at the point that all we're going to do is just reject him. We may want people to think that we're not, but we're just going to reject him. We done made up our minds. Because I want to do what I want to do. Maybe part of him I'll take, but the rest I'm not. Some of us are just using Jesus for what we can get out of it. It's relationships. It's getting mom and daddy off my back, or my wife off my back, or it's business deals, or it's standing in the community, or whatever. But what our reaction to Jesus needs to be is Mary. We need to worship him and honor him and serve him and sacrifice for him. And when we really get the reason Mary's willing to do that, Mary and Martha now, remember what they said when he got to town? If you'd have been here, our brother'd still be alive. They thought they knew Jesus, but when they really got that Jesus is the resurrection, Jesus is the life, then it's, I got to serve him. And when we really get to that point, then we'll have the same attitude that I've got to serve him. I've got to honor him. I've got to worship him. Sacrifice, it's no sacrifice because I know that he's Lord and I need him to be Lord of my life. So in chapter 12 and verse 12, we'll pick up there next Wednesday night, Lord willing, and we will see Jesus entering into Jerusalem. And again, the crowd is being whipped into a frenzy. More and more and more people love Jesus and want to know about Jesus and want to follow Jesus, not necessarily for the right reasons, but that's what's leading to what's going to happen in the next few chapters. So I hope that you will read the rest of chapter 12. We'll, again, pick up there next Wednesday night. Hope you have a good rest of your week. I appreciate Tucker especially for helping get all this set up tonight. All you have to do is say, Tucker, will you? And he says yes before you get the rest of the question out. And I love him and appreciate him for that. And appreciate all of you putting up with this. I know this is not maybe the best way to do class, but it allows me at least to connect with y'all on some level and to keep teaching John. And I love that and appreciate that. Love and appreciate all of y'all. Again, we miss you and love you and appreciate your prayers for us, and hope that you'll continue to keep us in your prayer while we travel back next Monday and Tuesday, and we'll see you again next week. I'm gonna sign off, Tucker, and we're gonna turn it over to Ron, who's gonna give you some announcements and then lead you in a closing prayer. But we'll see y'all next week.